Okay, this is Math Review 4-2. We're going to start with the distributive property. So if you wrote the titles down, then you get those 3 stars. The next thing we're going to talk about is this number sitting outside of the parentheses. Hopefully you remember that number, it has to be given to the numbers on the inside of the parentheses. And if we draw the little arrow to show that we are going to give it to the numbers or the terms inside of the parentheses, then that would be a star. The next thing that we have to point out is that the parentheses separating the 3 and the 5 means multiplication. So if you wrote down the word multiply like I did right now, that would be a star. Also, the addition symbol, labeling it like this, is also a star, since this is how we know that if we have multiplication and addition, that's going to be the distributive property, since it starts with a D, and D reminds us of the word double, since they both start with the letter D. And if you wrote the word double, then you also get a star for that. Now, the next thing that we're going to talk about is going to be this right here. It's going to be actually giving the 3 to the 5 by multiplying. So 3 times 5 would give you a star if you wrote that on your paper. And then we'll have a plus sign. So if you did not forget the plus sign, if you actually wrote it down like I did, then you get a star for that. Then the next thing to do is to give the 3 to the other term inside the parentheses, which is the x. So if you have that arrow on the top, you get a star for that. And when you give the 3 to the x, remember that means that you're multiplying. So we're going to write down 3 times x, and that would give you another star. Now, in this case, since 3 and 5 can be multiplied, we can go one step farther and go ahead and multiply them. So 3 times 5 would give us 15. So then we can actually have the last expression, which would be 15 plus, and that gives you another star. And in this case, would just be 3x, which is the same thing as 3 times x. So that would give you the last star for this problem, except for the key idea. The key idea, just like we did yesterday, is use the rainbow. That's the strategy. And as you can tell, there's 15 total stars in this question. Count how many you got, and then place them on top of the 15, just like I'm doing right now. So you can see how many stars out of the 15 you got on this question. The next problem talks about the integer operations. So we have 4 different titles, 1 for each operation, including the integer operations title, the key idea, and then the add, subtract, multiply, and divide. Each one of those gives you a star if you wrote down all those titles. Now we're actually going to start doing the addition. And in order for us to add, we have to remember the strategy. Remember that plus sign gives you the clue of the strategy. The plus sign looks kind of like a T, so that should remind you of the word teams. And if you remember the team strategy, if you label the team strategy, you get a star for that. But if you remember the T in teams, that's the T chart that we're going to draw. That's, in other words, that's the scoreboard. So that's the positive team against the negative team. If you have a scoreboard like I do right now sitting on your paper, give yourself a star for that. Now, you can tell that the first number, the 5, is positive, so that's going to go in the positive side, and then the negative, and that gives you a star. Then the negative 8 goes in the negative side, and that gives you a star if you put the numbers in the right place. So now that, you have to compare. The positive team got 5 goals, and the negative team got 8 goals. So who made more goals at the end of the game? And that would be the negative team. So that means the negatives win, but how many do they win by? And before we go to the answer, make sure you give yourself a star if you circled the winning team. In this case, is the negative team. Now we go to the answer. So we know the answer is going to be a negative answer since the negative team won. So that negative sign right there gives you a star. And then 8 beats 5 by 3 goals. So then that 3 also gives you a star. For subtracting, remember that the strategy for subtracting is we don't do that because subtracting doesn't exist. So instead of subtracting, we do this. The little saying that we have practiced in class is we're going to change the sign. We add a line. So that's what we're going to do. And if you wrote down the strategy, change the sign, add a line, then you get a star for that strategy right there. Okay. Now, finally, we're actually going to do that. That minus sign, we're going to change the sign to a plus sign. and then we're going to add a line on the second number like this. So each one of those, changing the sign gives you a star, and adding the line to the 9 gives you a star as well. Now we actually have an addition problem, so we can use the same strategy as we did for adding, which is the scoreboard. So if you have a scoreboard, then you go ahead and give yourself a star for that. And if it's a positive 6, we're going to put that 6 in the positive side, so that gives you a star for that. And then a 9 in the negatives. So obviously the 9 has more goals than the 6, so the negatives win in this case again, and that will give you a star if you circle the negative team because they won. And then the final answer is going to be a negative answer since they won, so that negative sign in the answer gives you a star. And finally, the 9 beats the 6 by 3 goals. So my final star goes there for subtraction. Then we go to multiply and divide. Remember that both of these have the same strategy. We use the same strategy, which is to transfer the negative signs to the answer. And if you wrote down the strategy, give yourself that star for writing down the strategy. Now we're actually going to multiply the 2 times the 7. 2 times 7 gives me 14. So if you have 14, you get a star for that. But don't forget, you have a negative sign. So the strategy is to circle the negative sign and then draw an arrow to the answer, which means we're transferring it to the answer. So if you have the circle and the arrow, give yourself a star for that. If you didn't do that, go ahead and write it with the red pen, and then that way you can remember for tomorrow that you need to do that. And then you actually have to write the negative sign on the answer. So that little negative sign gives you the final star for multiplication. So my final answer is negative 14. On the division, remember that line right there, that fraction bar, it's a division symbol. So we're going to do the strategy of remembering that by drawing the little 2 dots like I'm doing right now. So if you do that, I'll give you a star. And then 12 divided by 4 gives me the number 3. So the 3 gets a star. But don't forget the strategy, transfer the negative signs when we multiply and divide. So that negative on the 4 gets transferred to the answer. So if you circle the negative and you draw the arrow, that's a star. And if you actually drew the negative sign on the 3, that gives you the last star. So finally, we're going to write the key idea, which is use the correct strategies. And there were 31 stars in this question because there's a lot of little steps that we need to make sure we remember so we can get to the final answer every time. Question number 3 is the order of operations. Hopefully you remember the little saying, and that's the key idea, which is going to be, well, before we go into the saying, give yourself the 2 stars for the order of operations title and the key idea title if you wrote those down. If you didn't, then go ahead and pause the video and write them down with a red pen. Okay, so now the key idea, remember the little saying is, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. And each one of these words starts with a capital letter because each letter gives you the strategy for solving the order of operations. So if you wrote that key idea down, give yourself that star. And each one of those letters can be written down like this. Some people like to, instead of saying, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, some people just say PEMDAS, and they write it like this. And that's okay if you have that. You also give yourself a star because that's the other strategy that we're going to be writing down every time. But remember that multiplication and division have to be done in order from left to right. So if the same thing for addition and subtraction. So if you drew those 2 arrows, then you get a star for each because that is very, very important. So now we're going to start from the beginning. The P stands for parentheses, and we do have some parentheses in this problem, and that those 2 parentheses are grouping the addition of 1.6 plus 1.8. So we have to do that first. So that means we're going to underline what we're doing. Each step that we do in order of operations, we're going to underline the step that we're doing in that line because we only do one step at a time. So if you underline the sum of 1 and 6/10 plus 1 and 8/10, give yourself a star for underlining that. Now, to actually add the decimals, hopefully you remember from adding decimals at the beginning of the year that we have to line up the numbers by lining up the decimal points. Once we add it, 6 plus 8 is 14, carry the 1. 1 plus 1 plus 1 is 3, we bring down the decimal straight down. So remember that decimal has to be lined up. And if you have your addition shown somewhere on that paper, then you get that star for the addition problem. So now we're going to replace what's inside the parentheses with just the answer, which is 3 and 4/10. Now, if you have that answer, give yourself a star for that. Now, since there's nothing else to do inside of the parentheses, we're finished with the parentheses and we don't have to write them anymore. But we do have to write everything else on the problem down. We have to copy it straight down. So that minus sign, the 4.5, the plus sign, the 0.4, the other minus sign, and the 9.8. So now if you copied everything down just like I did, give yourself a star for doing that step correctly. The next thing that we have to check in our strategy is, do we have any exponents? And no, we don't have any of those little bitty numbers. So in this case, we can just cross out the E. We don't have any multiplication or division either. We just have addition and subtraction. So we have to do it in order from left to right. So that means that the first thing that we come to from left to right is this subtraction. So we're going to underline the first subtraction. And if you underline that, you get a star for that. So now you have 9.8 minus 0.4. And again, I'm going to show my work. And I'm going to line up my decimal points so that I can do the subtraction correctly. And if I do that right, then I end up with 9.4. And if I line up my decimals, that's the strategy for adding and subtracting decimals. That would give me a star for showing my work, my subtraction. And then finally, I replace the answer, replace that subtraction part with the answer, with the difference of 9.4. So 9.4 gets a star in my steps, and then copy everything else down exactly as I see it. So the plus sign, the 4.5, the minus sign, and the 3.4. And that gives me a star for copying everything down. So now we only have addition and subtraction. So again, we have to do them from left to right. So in this case, now we have an addition to do. So 9.4, or if you underline that step, then you get a star for that. So 9.4 plus 4.5. Once again, we line up the decimal and we do our addition correctly, bring down the decimal, and we get a star for that addition somewhere in our paper. We replace the addition with the result, with the sum of 13.9. That gives me a star. And then I copy everything else down, which is the minus sign and the 3.4. And that will also give me a star for copying everything else down. And the last thing we have to do is just a subtraction of 13.9 minus 3.4. And if you underline that last step, then you get a star for that. And finally, you have to show me the work one more time of how you lined up the decimals and how you subtracted correctly. And 9 minus 4 is 5, 3 minus 3 is 0, and 1 minus nothing is 1. Bring down the decimal. So my final answer, or showing my subtraction, gets a star. And then my final answer is the 10.5 or 10 and 5/10. So if you ended up with that answer, you give yourself the last star. Okay, in this question, we have 21 total stars. Count how many you got on your paper, and then put that on the top of your page. Not on top of your page, on the top of the 21. So you can have your fraction there. And then finally, we have the reflection. So we're going to choose one of these sentence stems for your reflection. So you can choose whichever one you want. You can choose the first one if you want to, which is, I think I am becoming an expert on. Tell me what you're becoming an expert on. And then you have to tell me why. So you have to say because, and how do you know that you're becoming an expert? Or you can choose the next one, which is, I know that I'm becoming more proficient with, and the word proficient just means that you're getting better at it. You're getting faster, and you're getting the same or you're getting the right answers. So how do you know, or you know that you're becoming more proficient with what? Specifically, which problem or which part of the problem? And then tell me, how do you know that? Because what? The third reflection sentence that you can choose is the I changed the way that I blank. So this is something that you changed, maybe your strategy or the way that you did something, and then tell me why. And then the last one that you can choose from is I was successful because blank. How do you know you were successful? How do you know you got something right? and then tell me I was unsuccessful because what? So why were you not successful? Why did you not get something right? What is it that you messed up on? What did you forget? What did you do wrong? And then tell me why. So that's the end of today's math review. When you finish this reflection, go ahead and turn in your math review spiral to the bookshelf, to the brown bookshelf, and then get started on your extra math.